All right. Wednesday, and you'll see that there is an abandoned building behind me. Interesting if you could figure out what building this is. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with the first or second video, the background in my first or second video. So we found out last time that the third lesson, not a big surprise, is holding anger is poison, and that Eddie needed to get that out. He needed to fix the problem and get past that. Remember again that there are three different kinds of parts of this book. There's Eddie going through in heaven, there's Eddie in the past, and then there's the time after the accident still on Earth. Thursday, 11 a.m. Who would pay for Eddie's funeral? He had no relatives. He'd left no instructions. His body remained at the city morgue, as did his clothes and personal effects, his maintenance shirt, his socks and shoes, his linen cap, his wedding ring, his cigarettes and pipe cleaners, all awaiting claim. In the end, Mr. Bullock, the park owner, footed the bill using the money he saved from Eddie's no longer cashable paycheck. The casket was a wooden box. The church was chosen by location, the one nearest the pier, as most attendees had to get back to work. A few minutes before the service, the pastor asked Dominguez, wearing a navy blue sport coat and his good black jeans, to step inside his office. Could you share some of the deceased's unique qualities? The pastor asked. I understand you worked with him. Dominguez swallowed. He was none too comfortable with clergymen. He hooked his fingers together earnestly, as if giving the matter some thought, and spoke as softly as he thought one should speak in such a situation. Eddie, he finally said, really loved his wife. He unhooked his fingers, then added quickly, of course I never met her. Excuse me. The fourth person Eddie meets in heaven. Well, we're down to two choices. Lost love is still love, or all lives have meaning or value. I will tell you that Mitch album, with a little bit of foreshadowing, just gave us a hint as to who the fourth person in heaven is going to be. And if you can deduce who the fourth person Eddie meets in heaven is, then you will probably also be able to deduce what is the fourth lesson. The fourth person Eddie meets in heaven. Eddie blinked and found himself in a small round room. The mountains were gone, and so was the jade sky. A low plaster ceiling just missed his head. The room was brown, as plain as shipping wrap, and empty save for a wooden chair and an oval mirror on the wall. Eddie stepped in front of the mirror. He cast no reflection. He saw only the reverse of the room, which expanded suddenly to include a row of doors. Eddie turned around. Then he coughed. The sound startled him, as if it came from someone else. He coughed again, a hard rumbling cough, as if things needed to be resettled in his chest. When did this start? Eddie thought. He touched his skin, which had aged since his time with Ruby. It felt thinner now and drier. His midsection, which during his time with the captain had felt tight as pulled rubber, was now loose with flab, the droop of age. There are still two people for you to meet, Ruby had said. And then what? His lower back had a dull ache. His bad leg was growing stiffer. He realized what was happening. It happened with each new stage of heaven. He was rotting away. He approached one of the doors and pushed it open. Suddenly he was outside, in the yard of a home he had never seen, in a land he did not recognize, in the midst of what appeared to be a wedding reception. Guests holding silver plates filled the grassy lawn. At one end stood an archway covered in red flowers and birch branches, and at the other end, next to Eddie, stood the door that he'd walked through. The bride, young and pretty, was in the center of the group. Excuse me. uh, removing a pin from her butter-colored hair. The groom was lanky. He wore a black wedding coat and held up a sword, and at the hilt of the sword was a ring. He lowered it toward the bride, and guests cheered as she took it. Eddie heard their voices, but the language was foreign, German, Swedish. He coughed again. The group looked up. Every person seemed to smile, and the smiling frightened Eddie. He backed quickly through the door from which he'd entered, figuring to return to the round room, and instead he was in the middle of another wedding, indoors this time, in a large hall, where people looked Spanish, and the bride wore orange blossoms in her hair. She was dancing from one partner to the next, and each guest handed her a small sack of coins. Eddie coughed again. He couldn't help it, and when several of the guests looked up, he backed through the door and again entered a different wedding scene. Something African, Eddie guessed, where families poured wine onto the ground and the couple held hands and jumped over a broom. Then another passed through another door to a Chinese reception, where firecrackers were lit before cheering attendees, and then another doorway to something else, maybe French, where the couple drank together from a two-handled cup. How long does this go on, Eddie thought. In each reception there were no signs of how the people had gotten there, no cars or buses, no wagons, no horses. Departure did not appear to be an issue. The guests milled about, and Eddie was absorbed as one of them, smiled at but never spoken to, much like the handful of weddings he'd gone to on Earth. He preferred it that way. Weddings were, in Eddie's mind, too full of embarrassing moments, like when couples were asked to join in a dance or to help lift the bride in a chair. His bad legs seemed to glow at those moments, and he felt as if people could see it from across the room. Because of that, Eddie avoided most receptions, and when he did go, he often stood in the parking lot smoking a cigarette, waiting for time to pass. For a long stretch, there were no weddings to attend anyhow. Only in the late years of his life, when some of his teenage peer workers had grown up and taken spouses, did he find himself getting the faded suit out of the closet and putting on the collared shirt that pinched his thick neck. By this point, his once fractured leg bones were spurred and deformed. Arthritis had invaded his knee. He limped badly and was thus excused from all participatory moments such as dances or candle lightings. He was considered an old man, alone, unattached, and no one expected him to do much besides smile when the photographer came to the table. Here now, in his maintenance clothes, he moved from one wedding to the next, one reception to another, one language, one cake, and one type of music to another language, another cake, and another type of music. The uniformity did not surprise Eddie. He always figured a wedding here was not much different from a wedding there. What he didn't get was what this had to do with him. He pushed through the threshold one more time and found himself in what appeared to be an Italian village. There were vineyards on the hillsides and farmhouses of travertine stone. Many of the men had thick black hair combed back and wet, and the women had dark eyes and sharp features. Eddie found a place against a wall and watched the bride and groom cut a log in half with a two-handed ripsaw. Music played, flautists, violinists, guitarists, and guests began the tarantella, dancing in a wild, twirling rhythm. Eddie took a few steps back. His eyes wandered to the edge of the crowd. A bridesmaid in a long lavender dress and a stitched straw hat moved through the guests with a basket of candy-covered almonds. From afar, she looked to be in her 20s. "Per l'amoro e le dolci," she said, offering her sweets. "Per l'amoro e le dolci, per l'amoro e le dolci." At the sound of her voice, Eddie's whole body shook. He began to sweat. Something told him to run, but something else froze his feet to the ground. She came his way. Her eyes found him from beneath the hat brim, which was topped with parchment flowers. "Per l'amoro e le dolci," she said, smiling, holding out the almonds. "For the bitter and the sweet." Her dark hair fell over one eye, and Eddie's heart nearly burst. His lips took a moment to part, and the sound from the back of his throat took a moment to rise, but they came together in the first letter of the only name that ever made him feel this way. He dropped to his knees. "Marguerite," he whispered. "For the bitter and the sweet," she said. Well, now we know who the fourth person in heaven is, and now you should probably be able to make a really, really good guess as to what the fourth lesson is. All lives have meaning or value, or lost love is still love. And then, if you're correct, then that would tell us what the fifth lesson is also. It kind of works out that way. It's like a true-false thing. What's the building behind me here? All right. Bye now.